and welcome to this episode of Genesis Week, the weekly program of creationary commentary on news, views, and events pertaining to the Origins controversy. Remember, if you get lost in cyberspace, you can just punch in wazulu.com or genesisweek.com, and you will find us. And also subscribe to our YouTube channel to get extras like Crevo rants and full interviews with our guests. I'm your host, Ian Juby. So I was raked over the coals again recently on Facebook for Crevo rant number 71, the population problem. I pointed out that the world's population fits spectacularly with observed population growth statistics and the biblical timeline. Now, if we start off with 4 couples who survived the near extinction of the entire human race at the time of Noah's flood, about 4,500 years ago, we'll arrive at our present 7 billion people with an average growth rate of about 0.46%. Now, typical growth rate in recent years has been 1.092%. So our needed figure is actually a little conservative. I was first criticized for using an exponential growth rate. Yeah. Technically, the math I used was a compound interest formula. What formula would you expect to use? The data, the scientific evidence, the facts show an exponential growth rate. Yes, there's variation on that line. So what? Wars, famine, and pestilence is already incorporated into that chart. The overall big picture clearly shows an exponential growth rate. So why then would certain people not use an exponential growth rate in their discussion? The only people who do not use an exponential growth rate are those trying to defend evolution and deep time. Dr. Anderson put it succinctly in last week's show. Evolution is used to calibrate the data. Evolution demands a fudge factor to make the data fit evolution. Watch what happens when you attempt to invoke deep time. This chart is straight off the Wikipedia page. Though the chart fits beautifully with the biblical timeline of the human population starting 6,000 years ago, evolution assumes people have been around for some 200,000 years. So just when you think the graph would hit 0, evolution and deep time demand the insertion of a number of unrealistic assumptions, like a near-extinction human population, with a growth rate of 0 for some 190,000 years. Now, this part of the chart is based on actual data. This part is either extrapolated from the data or a reasonable guess based on archaeology. And this part, forced by evolutionary theory and deep time, is based strictly upon the demands of deep time and evolution. Now, the skeptics, of course, claim there was an explosive population growth somewhere around 10,000 years ago or so with the advent of agriculture. The previous hunter-gatherer lifestyle would limit the population. It's also suggested an alleged beneficial mutation occurred that allowed the people to leave the sea as a primary source of food. Now, I cannot overemphasize how many assumptions, guesses, and wishes are packed into that short sentence. The timescale itself is calibrated by evolutionary assumptions and deep time. It's assumed that humans did not partake in agriculture from the beginning. There's a subtle assumption that our ancestors were stupider compared to us. It assumes there was no population growth for 190,000 years. Now, you are certainly welcome to assume all this, and you are certainly welcome to believe it, but please notice this is imaginary data, an absence of evidence. Using the same amount of land we use today with our modern growing and harvesting practices and harvesting equipment, the historic native Indians figured out ways to grow 3 times the amount of food we do. I go into some details of my response to TLD on YouTube. Suffice it to say, it is strictly an assumption that we did not always have agriculture and an assumption that our ancestors did not know agriculture better than we do. It's also an assumption that is in direct contradiction to the biblical account of creation, where God put the first man and woman in a garden to till the garden and to keep it. Furthermore, the critics completely ignored the second significant point I made in the population problem rant. Where are all the graves? If we do use the unrealistic numbers provided by the skeptics, you still have an incredible number of graves of people. The evolutionary time scale dates some graves found at 130,000 years old. That's a long time ago. So, people were burying their dead along with artifacts, etc., for at least 130,000 of those 200,000 years. Extrapolating population numbers, we arrive at about 164 graves for every square kilometer of dry land on planet Earth. Dry land which includes the mountains, swamps, bedrock, and places where nobody would bury a body. So the concentration is, of course, much higher for the land available for burial. Now, even if you assume that all the bodies simply rotted away, you would still find artifacts and other evidence of graves. Again, the skeptics will attempt to explain all of this away, bringing us back to my main point again. You are arguing from an absence of evidence, not because of the evidence. May I suggest it is not the graves that are missing, but rather the assumed deep time. I say all that to say this. In order to accommodate evolution in deep time, you must produce imaginary data, wild and unrealistic speculations, and argue using evidence that is absence. All the while, the biblical timeline requires no fudge factoring whatsoever, and in fact, just plain fits the evidence. The Bible fits the scientific evidence. Evolutionary theory and deep time does not. Interestingly, these assumptions of population stasis and explosion cropped up in a Nature paper this past week. I like the way David Coppedge put it, the human genome is in meltdown. Many of you will recall Crevo Rant number 78, the boat that don't float. The main point was that the human DNA is deteriorating, and fast. Geneticist Dr. Jonathan Sanford, co-inventor of the gene gun, and a former evolutionist, now turned young Earth creationist, exhaustively documented this DNA deterioration in his book, Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome. Basically, each generation is accumulating minor errors in their DNA, errors that are missed by the DNA repair systems, but don't cause catastrophic genetic failure, better known as death. The errors are passed on to the next generation, which accumulates its own errors, which passes the old and new errors on to the next generation, and so on. This continual collection of errors replaces the information in the DNA with noise. Eventually, there is no information left on how to build nor maintain a human body, and only genetic noise. And the human race dies. Evolution requires the gaining of information, but genetic loss is what is observed, and it is happening so fast that we could not have been around for hundreds of thousands of years because we'd be extinct. A paper by geneticists from 4 different universities came out in the January 10th issue of Nature. They examined exomes. Exomes are a specific part of the DNA. They were looking specifically for errors that had occurred in the DNA, replacing one of the letters in the string with another letter. The letters are called nucleotides, and so changing one of the letters is called a single nucleotide variant, or SNV for short. So just remember that an SNV is a single letter changed in the DNA. Now, some of that DNA is used as a jig for building proteins, while some DNA is instructions. After examining over 15,000 genes in over 6,500 individuals from around the world, The researchers estimated that approximately 73% of all protein-coding SNVs and approximately 86% of SNVs predicted to be deleterious arose in the past 5,000 to 10,000 years. In other words, some 73 to 86% of the errors in the human DNA have occurred in the past 5 to 10,000 years. On an evolutionary timescale, 5 to 10,000 years ago is yesterday. Notice the unmentioned assumptions that we discussed with regards to population and time. The researchers assumed the dramatic increase in DNA errors was caused by a population explosion in the last 5 to 10,000 years. This Nature paper dramatically confirms again what Dr. Sanford has been saying. Our DNA is deteriorating, and quickly. If all these errors occurred in the last 10,000 years, how then do you expect the human race to evolve? Adding 190,000 years to the picture doesn't produce human evolution. It only multiplies the accumulated errors by 190-fold and produces human extinction. This is a very loud genetic alarm clock.